Hi class. For this week's building background, we are going to compare Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. We're going to investigate this article here, and you guys will then think about, discuss, and answer the questions in the assignment. So Malcolm and Martin, closer than we ever thought. Let's see how. We know this picture is from the one moment in their careers that they met. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. was leaving a news conference one afternoon when a tall man with a coppery complexion stepped out of the crowd and blocked his path. This is a photo of the one time that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Met in person. Malcolm X, the African-American Muslim leader who once called King Reverend Dr. Chickenwing, extended his hand and smiled. "Well, Malcolm, good to see you," King said after taking Malcolm X's hand. "Good to see you," Malcolm X replied, as both men broke into huge grins, with a gaggle of photographers snapped pictures of their only meeting. That encounter on March 26, 1964, lasted only a minute, but a photo of that meeting has tantalized scholars and supporters of both men for more than 45 years. As the 85th birthday of Malcolm X is marked on Wednesday, let's pause here for a second. This article comes from 2010, May. Okay, so he would be 95 now, 96. As the 85th birthday of Malcolm X is marked on Wednesday, history has freeze-framed him as the angry black separatist who saw whites as blue-eyed devils. Yet near the end of his life, Malcolm X was becoming more like King, and King was becoming more like him. Okay, so this is what we're going to pay attention to. In what ways did the two leaders start to agree on how to protest most effectively? What their aim was always the same, but how to get there is what they were trying to figure out. And we're still trying to figure out. In the last years of their lives, they were starting to move toward one another, says David Howard Pitney, who recounted the Capitol Hill meeting in his book, Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and the Civil Rights Struggle of the 1950s and 60s. While King is moderating from his earlier position, King was becoming more militant, Pitney says. Okay, so this is an important detail as how they're moving towards the same ideal. Malcolm X was reaching out to King even before he broke away from the Nation of Islam and embraced Sunni Islam after a pilgrimage to Mecca, says Andrew Young, a member of King's inner circle at the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the civil rights group King headed. Even before his trip to Mecca, Malcolm used to come by the SCLC's office, Young says. Unfortunately, Dr. King was never there when he came. How Malcolm became a cultural revolutionary. Though the men met only once, they had been portrayed as foes in the minds of the American public for years. Portrayed, shown, again, by whom? The media, making them oppositions rather than allies in this common fight for equal rights. Starting here, Malcolm X burst onto the national scene in 1959 when he and the Nation of Islam were featured in a documentary, The Hate That Hate Produced. He became the Nation of Islam's most visible spokesman from his base in New York. And while King preached about his dream, Malcolm X said blacks were trapped in a nightmare. It was his critique of America from the bottom up that was so shocking. He was a young man with a PhD mind, but he was put out of school. He educated himself in jail by reading the dictionary. Malcolm X's harsh rhetoric helped decolonize Black people's minds by teaching them to be proud of their African heritage, says James Cone, author of Martin and Malcolm and America. King was a political revolutionary, and Malcolm was a cultural revolutionary. Let's underline that as well. King was a political revolutionary, and Malcolm was a cultural revolutionary. Malcolm changed how Black people thought about themselves. Before Malcolm came along, we were all Negroes. After Malcolm, he helped us become Black. Despite their differences, both King and Malcolm X's political activism flowed from the same source, says Pitney, the civil rights scholar. They were fundamentally spiritual men, Pitney says, and while we remember them for their social and political activism, they were religious and spiritual at their core. Malcolm moves towards Martin. Okay, so here we'll find some details about how Malcolm X's beliefs and strategies to obtain civil rights start moving towards Martin Luther King's ideals. Malcolm X, though, wanted to be more than a cultural revolutionary. He broke with the Nation of Islam in March 1964 and announced plans to start a Black political organization. He reached out to King and other civil rights leaders. In 1965, Malcolm X traveled to Selma, Alabama, where King was leading a campaign to offer support. Brother Malcolm was definitely making an outreach to some civil rights leaders, says A. Peter Bailey, an original member of the group Malcolm founded, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, and a friend of Malcolm X. He believed that the one who would be most responsive would be Dr. King. The Muslim leader had developed an appreciation for King, Bailey says. He had come to believe that King believed in what he was doing. He believed in nonviolence. It wasn't just a show. He developed respect for him. I heard him say, "You have to give respect to men who put their lives on the line." Malcolm X may have been willing to join the civil rights cause, but he never subscribed to nonviolence or abandoned his Muslim faith. The whole idea that he had become a token integrationist at the end of his life, that's a bunch of jive, Bailey says. Okay, so if we see here, he was looking for unity amongst the different Black civil rights organization. So he had started the Organization of African American Unity, and he was reaching out to King and the Southern leaders, Southern Christian Leadership Conference organization. Martin moves towards Malcolm. Now we're going to see in what ways did Martin Luther King start to move to some of the beliefs and strategies of Malcolm X. King's movement toward Malcolm began as he shifted the civil rights movement to the North, Friends and Scholars says. During the last 3 years of his life, King became more radical. He talked about eliminating poverty and providing a guaranteed annual income for all U.S. citizens. He came out against the Vietnam War and said American society would have to be restructured. He also veered into Malcolm X's rhetorical territory when he started preaching Black self-pride. King is photographed a number of times in 1967 and 68 wearing a Black is Beautiful button. A year before King died, the journalist David Halberstam even told him he sounded like a nonviolent Malcolm X. In the epic PBS civil rights series, Coretta Scott King, the civil rights leader's widow, said King never took Malcolm X's biting criticisms of his nonviolent stance personally. "I know Martin had the greatest respect for Malcolm," she said. "I think that if Malcolm had lived, at some point the two would have come closer together and would have been a very strong force." Young, King's close aide, says King had become more militant near the end of his life. "It was more radical to deal with poverty than to deal with segregation, so in that sense it's true. But Dr. King never wavered in his commitment to nonviolence. In fact, he was getting stronger in his commitment to nonviolence. It was more of a militant nonviolence. Why they endure. Malcolm X and King never had the chance, though, to explore an alliance. Malcolm X was assassinated in Harlem in 1965, and King was murdered 3 years later. Both were 39 at the time of their death. Both had been abandoned by former supporters, and both left virtually no money to their wives and young children because they refused to profit from their activism. The photo of their meeting endures. It is taken because both men happened to be in the Capitol building that day to listen to politicians debate the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which would later pass. Arthur Cohn says the picture endures because both men embody the yin and yang deep in the soul of Black America. Even as King was changing America, he also realized that Malcolm X was changing him. Cohn says with a chuckle, Martin Luther King once said that when he listened to Malcolm speak, even he got angry.